So, welcome to Ethics 201. This is the second part of Lecture 3. You've just watched the video on the changing nature of capitalism. As you can see, that's a very pro-capitalism video and puts a lot of justifications for the relevance and importance of capitalism as an economic system in society. What we're going to do now is move on to look at Objective 3 and Objective 4. Objective 3 is understanding some of the different perspectives on economic distribution as part of considering the moral implications of an economic system. And Objective 4 is looking at some of the theoretical and operational criticisms of capitalism. Then there's another video that we'll watch, which is called Is Capitalism Moral?, before moving on to Objective 5 and 6, which talks about an alternate system, socialism, and also looks at some of the challenges facing Western capitalistic society. So here goes. First issue we need to consider under our understanding of the different perspectives of economic distribution is human nature. Contemporary capitalism relies on people to continue buying and consuming more and more and more goods. It requires people to choose to work more, so to work more so that they can consume more. And research has found that people are no more pleased with their lives than they were in the 1950s when they had less. There's been a substantial increase in the standard of living, and people are not happier or more satisfied. This means that there are some issues related to how we perceive capitalism and how we perceive the underlying assumption of capitalism that people will choose to work more so that they can consume more. Now, I'm not saying people don't do that. You only have to look around at what we all do. But not everybody does that. And there are arguments that seeking continuous economic growth has some consequences for society, for people, for the natural environment. We're going to look at some of those consequences and the balance between business and those later in the course. So let's look at some of the key theories that we've used to talk about ethics and moral stances. And we're also going to add a theory from Rawls, which is a way of looking at capitalism, which draws from some of the theories that we've talked about last week, and how they apply to economic distribution. Economic distribution is basically who has what in society. So, first let's look at utilitarianism. You'll remember that last week we talked about utilitarianism as one of the theoretical frameworks of ethics. So, what sort of economic arrangement should best promote human happiness? Because as we know, one of the goals of utilitarianism is human happiness. We need to consider the type of economic ownership and the ways that production is organised. Who owns what? What is the balance between public and private ownership? Should the government be providing roads and health and education and the military? What extent of services should they offer compared with the balance of what extent of services should be offered by business? And who owns those factors of production? Should business pay for the pollution that they produce? Should business pay for the resources, raw materials that they use? Should they pay to use the roads and railways? Should they build all the roads and railways and people can only use them if they pay for them? What type of authority arrangements exist within units of production? Is it owned by a ruling class or the owners of the business, and what they say goes? Or is there some balance between business and government and regulation? Or is there ownership that is broader with the members of the organisation all sharing the economic benefits of the performance of that organisation? How do you deal with the types and character of material incentives? How do you deal with the rewards for performance? And there's a lot of discussion, a lot of argument related to how much money CEOs get, how much money senior managers get, as they improve the performance of the company, compared with how much the workers get, and the relative ratio between how many times the average weekly earning of the workers in the organisation do the management and CEOs get. Should incentives be based on just financial performance, or should they be based on broader things? Who benefits within the organisation from those incentives? And finally, the nature and extent of social security and welfare provisions. Are businesses responsible for providing that welfare? If not in a capitalist society, who does provide that welfare? Who should pay for the provision of health, education? And we could go on with a range of things that in a mixed economy tend to be offered by government. And we've noted a couple of times that the US is a bit of an outlier in the way it provides, as an economically developed country, in the way it provides health. Every other capitalist society has some form of universal health. Many have a mix of private and public health provision, but there's universal health coverage. There's a safety net. How do we deal with societies that are changing when industry is changing from one form of industry to another? How do we support the workers and keep societal stability as change occurs in the society? So those are the things you would consider in a utilitarian approach to capitalism. In the libertarian approach, which is a justice-based approach, individuals have the rights and freedom from interference. So therefore, government should not be interfering with the actions of a person. They should be able to live as they want to, as he or she wants to, and be responsible for themselves. The right for property ownership is fundamental. Each individual should have the right to property ownership. And finally, fraud is forbidden. Now you could see that these are approaches that are based on self-interest. And in the pure libertarian approach, less consideration is paid to the effects that your actions may have on others. Now, there are modified libertarian approaches where they say, well, you have the right of freedom from interference, but you need to be aware of the impacts you're having on others. But it's a justice approach. Nozick's theory of justice, which is our next theoretical approach, which fits within this different perspective from utilitarianism, this libertarian perspective, though not necessarily a pure libertarian perspective. A person who acquires a holding in accordance with the principle of justice of acquisition, so they're entitled to buy it, is entitled to have that. So if you purchase part of a company, or you purchase something, you're entitled to have that. You're entitled to transfer that, to sell that to whoever you want. And no one is entitled to that holding except through those two processes. You acquire it and you can sell it. So you can see that government and society are excluded from Nozick's theory of justice. Rawls' theory of justice is a little bit different. Rawls' theory of justice is a modified theory of justice, therefore it's a modification of the libertarian approach. It says that certain familiar and fundamental liberties to each person are guaranteed, but social and economic inequities are only justified if they benefit the least advantaged members of society. So, you guarantee the liberties of people, but you try to bring up people that are disadvantaged in society up to the higher level to benefit. So you may provide scholarships to disadvantaged students so that they can move up in an education setting. You may have recruitment and selection programs that provide some advantage to social and economically disadvantaged people so that they can participate in society more fully, get the type of jobs that they may have been barred from in the past. You may have a social safety net, or have a cut-off progressive taxation, or a level of income where you're providing social support and free education and free health services, and then as society, and to pay for that, you may in fact charge people at the higher level of society in a less disadvantaged part of society, the middle and upper class, to fund the role of governments at that level. You may provide concessions for students so that they can study and travel by train and bus. I know that it's one of the things that the Victorian government doesn't provide to international students, for example, but does to domestic students. Rawls's position of allowing this what is an inequity, because you're giving something that isn't based purely on the governing principles of you get what you can pay for. He had a libertarian position. He argued that you need to look at the original position of the individual, of society, as a strategy for promoting justice. So each individual should choose principles purely on the basis of self-interest, but those chosen principles agreed on are based not only on freedom of choice, but also on equality and equity. So you're trying to make a fundamental value, a fundamental principle, a fundamental liberty is equality. Now, if you are following Rawls' perspective, that creates a set of issues, because you could argue that people are more or less entitled. If you're following Nozick's libertarian perspective, it actually creates a greater amount of irreconcilable differences between the rights of people. The wealthy are more likely to choose Nozick's entitlement theory because they get the most benefit out of it. Those without property are more likely to be in favour of a redistribution of wealth. Again, looking at American society and the capitalist system, we look at the inequity between the net worth of African Americans and the net worth of white, non-African American families. Okay? Because there has been the main wealth that the middle class has, the main wealth that all classes have below the richest grouping, is the wealth that derives from ownership of real estate. So the difference in the net worth of Americans who are not African American and Americans who are African American almost comes down, can almost all be explained by the lack of access to the property market, the systemic discrimination in the property market, the barriers to owning property, the barriers to moving into particular suburbs that were being legally applied until the mid-60s and then illegally applied in many cases since then. In the mid-60s, there was a constitutional amendment. So the inability for African Americans to generate the amount of wealth and ownership from property because of systemic discrimination has led to them being economically disadvantaged and therefore unable to participate to the same extent in society, unable to exercise the same level of liberty. So how do you, and there's a certain level of deniability in this, in Nozick's theory, is that this isn't recognised. This is called the veil of ignorance. So to overcome this, Rawls asks us to imagine from the original position that people were in, how does that affect our social status, the position they hold in society, and is that fair? And therefore, should we possibly discriminate for people? Should we provide particular additional services for particular groups of people? And how does that align with our conception of rights? And Rawls would argue, well, that's clearly aligns with our conception of rights, that our rights need to be broadened out to do that. So this lack of knowledge, if people in the original position do not know their race intelligence skills, they would not argue from a self-interested point of view. This uncertainty forces impartiality and objectiveness and then creates our sense of fairness. And in a sense of fairness, you want to support those that are less advantaged than you to raise society, to raise people in society. Okay, so that's objective 3. Objective 3, when we looked at the different perspectives on economic distribution. The utilitarian position, the libertarian position, the rights position, and a modification of that using Rawls. Now we're going to... Oh, sorry, I've just missed a slide, I think. I have indeed. Yes, I've missed the summary slide. I apologise for that. People in the original position will eventually settle on 2 basic governing principles. Each person has the equal right to the most extensive total system of equal basic liberties comparable with a similar system of liberty for all. Social and economic inequities need to be addressed through equal opportunity so that you get the greatest benefit being provided to the least advantaged members of society. I did say that slightly differently before, but this is the same principle. That wraps up, therefore, our look at the different perspectives: utilitarianism, libertarianism, and Rawls' modification of libertarianism, Rawls' justice approach. We're now going to move on to objective 4, which is, in objective 4, we're going to look at some of the theoretical and operational criticisms of capitalism, and that will lead into the video, Is Capitalism Moral? So what are the criticisms of capitalism? I've mentioned some of them as we've gone along already. To make a rational choice, you need to have a high level of consumer literacy. You need to know things, and always the business knows more about their product than you do. The second criticism of capitalism is that it leads to inequality, in that a very small percentage, the 1%, as they call them in political debate, owns the vast majority of wealth. The third criticism, and is that equitable? The third criticism of capital is the concept of the free market. Corporate welfare protects many businesses from marketplace competition. The government rescued, for example, all the car manufacturers in the US. The government provides tax breaks and incentives and payroll cuts to attract businesses to a particular area. Through regulation, the government reduces competition. or limits competition, say in telecommunications. So all these things limit the marketplace. And businesses contribute to that limiting by the lobbying that they do. Even thinking about the COVID-19 situation we have at the moment, untried, untested drugs are being actively promoted by business to government and then by government externally, particularly a malaria drug being promoted by Donald Trump, that don't seem to have a basis in science. There are promises of free, in the US, free access to testing, but not free access to treatment, because there are structural barriers to competition. Final thing is that capitalism breeds oligopolies. Capitalism leads us to having a situation where there's one or two, or monopoly is one, or just a few companies operating in a particular area, and they can set prices. They can control the market. There was a large scandal a few years ago in Australia where the fire sprinklers like we have in this building, the fire sprinkler companies were acting and colluding together in a way that produced, which means they were bidding for service and installation contracts and setting the prices. Amazon has a significant, and Walmart have significant, powerful positions in the US marketplace. Coles and Woolworths have the same type of position here, Coles and Woolworths. They are an oligopoly. They almost set the price. They have a lot of power over their suppliers. So in that case, smaller firms suffer because they have high costs. And if you look at some of the smaller competitors, for say Woolworths has just announced that it's not going to be charging rent. And people went, not going charging rent for who? For the small businesses. It was only then that people realised that many of the Woolworths sites is the Woolworths supermarket, and every other small store pays rent to Woolworths. The site is owned by Woolworths. We have debates about the high cost of retail rents, of restaurant rents, that mean that small businesses suffer. Complex and expensive machinery, intense competitive advantage from large-scale production mean that large firms can set prices, can eliminate competition, can monopolise industries. What are some of the corporate welfare programs that protect businesses? I mentioned some of them before, but things like import restrictions, training subsidies, and research and development subsidies. Much of the profit that's made by pharmaceutical companies comes from basic research that is undertaken by the government, by government-funded universities. The government in Australia subsidises industry with an extended tax break for research and development, loosely defined. Up to 3 times the amount of money that you spend on R&D can be written off your profit for taxation purposes. Larger companies are more likely to have free capital to enable them to do R&D and to benefit from that performance, which blocks out small companies. What are the other criticisms? Well, competition is not in itself a good thing. We see frequent negative correlations between the performance of companies and individual competitiveness. Sometimes you see companies competing that don't produce a net benefit to the consumer or to society. They compete, it doesn't produce the lowest cost, it just produces competition. It doesn't produce sustainability, it produces competition. So the outcomes of competition are not always a good thing. Employers are able to exploit workers by paying them less than the true value created by their labour, And if we look at the wages within Australia, we've got about a 2% growth rate of wages in Australia, which is significantly lower than the growth rate of corporate profits. And legal and political and economic changes have given employers greater ability to exploit the labour of their workers. That again is one of the criticisms. And I'm saying these criticisms as almost absolutes because I wanted to give you the counterpoint to capitalism. It reinforces consumerism, the continuous need to acquire, to be materialistic, to be individualist, which may in fact not benefit society as a whole. And it requires humans to consume and consume and consume more and more and more, but an increased standard of living does not deliver the promised benefits. Okay, so that's the end of part 2 of the lecture. What I would like you to do now is watch the video, Is Capitalism Moral?, before we come back and we look at part 3 of the lecture, when we're going to look at the key features and criticisms of socialism, which is an alternate economic system, and we're going to talk about some of the contemporary socio-economic challenges facing Western capitalism. Just before I go on to that, though, I want to draw your attention to the videos that we're using in the tutorial as well, which are directly related to this particular section of the lecture.